Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth day of the event Virtual Edition UK Brazil Partners in Energy. My name is Laura Martucci, and I am the Commercial Analyst for the Maritime Sector at the Department for International Trade in Brazil. The objective of the conference is to enable discussions and collaboration between Brazil and the UK on several themes around energy. Today's event is about IMO's low carbon targets for the maritime industry. The event has simultaneous translation. To access the language, just select the interpretation function on the bottom bar of your screen and choose the language of your preference. This functionality is available only on Zoom app. If you access by browser, you will hear only the original language. In the same section on the bottom bar, you'll find the Q&A function. Feel free to use it anytime to send questions, since those will be transmitted to the speakers. We would like to make this event as interactive as possible, so we encourage the use of the chat and the Q&A throughout the event. The presentations will be available on the event website in the coming days, the same website that you use for registration. The webinars are being recorded and will be available in our UK in Brazil YouTube channel soon. Now, I would like to introduce the moderator of the panel, Emma Johnson. Emma has a master's degree in marine and aquatic biology from the University of Portsmouth. She worked for a sensor manufacturing company for 3 years with a focus on maritime products. Since joining the Society of Maritime Industries, SMI, in September last year, her focus has been on the marine autonomous systems and marine science and technology groups. Now, I hand over to Emma, and I wish you all a great day of discussions and mutual learning. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this fantastic conference series. The sessions over the last 3 days have been really insightful, and I hope that our session today will not disappoint. It is a shame that we can't be in person in Brazil in the heat or the sunshine, but there's always next year, so we can look forward to that. I'd just like to quickly apologise in advance for my lack of Portuguese language skill and the pronunciation of any names that I may get wrong. So I'm thrilled to welcome you all today to our session on the future challenges of the IMO's agenda and how these rules can be applied. As you all know, the shipping industry is regulated by the International Maritime Organization, or the IMO, which develops and maintains the framework of global maritime safety regulations. Considering the current challenges and the future prospects on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from ships, important questions must be asked, such as, are countries prepared for IMO's 2030 targets, and what were the successes of the 2020 ambitions? The main objectives of this webinar today are to showcase the UK's regulatory framework, understand how the targets are being implemented internally, and to compare this with the experiences in Brazil. In order to do this, I'm joined by 4 fantastic speakers today. And so we will start with 2 from the UK. We'll start with Charles Haskell from Lloyd's Register. Then we'll move on to Dr. Edmund Hughes, and then Vice Admiral Alexandre Cursino, and then finally Dr. Lavina Hollander. So now I'm thrilled to introduce our first speaker for today, Charles Haskell from Lloyd's Register. Charles is Lloyd's Register's Decarbonisation Programme Manager and leads the Lloyd's Register Maritime Decarbonisation Hub. He's been with Lloyd's Register for more than 15 years, first in a practical hands-on role as a project manager for new ship construction in South Korea, and then as a surveyor and auditor in the Middle East, before he returned to the UK as a business development manager for Lloyd's Register's marine and offshore business stream. He's a very keen yachtsman in his spare time. Charles will present for us today on net zero transition pathways. Please do remember to put your questions to the speakers in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now over to you, Charles. I look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Let me just pull up my screen. Okay, fantastic. As Emma introduced, I'm the program manager of the Lloyd's Register Maritime Decarbonisation Hub. The hub was set up in joint collaboration between the Lloyd's Register Group and the owner of the group, which is a charitable foundation, the Lloyd's Register Foundation. And its purpose is for the safe and sustainable decarbonisation of the maritime industry and to accelerate its progress. But I'll move over this and give an overview of what we're doing, but also the challenges ahead. So I think the first point is to point out that decarbonisation is not just a shipping problem or a shipping challenge, I should rather say. This is a global problem across many industries as well as the shipping industry. And this is important because the challenge is only going to be faced through collaboration across industry in both terms of sharing knowledge, but also ensuring that we're not competing for various fuels. So to reflect fully on the IMO ambitions at the moment, and I think it's important to clarify that these are currently ambitions and not regulatory policy. The ambition is to halve absolute greenhouse gas emissions from the shipping industry by 2050, and to do more if possible. Now, from the work we've done in the past in conjunction with UMass is what we've identified is that in order to reach 2050 ambitions, we're going to need to have zero emission vessels on the water by 2030. Furthermore, if left unchecked and the maritime industry doesn't move towards decarbonisation, currently shipping emits 2.3% of global CO2 emissions. This will rise to 10% by the mid-century as other industries decarbonize and the maritime industry continues doing what it is doing at the moment. So they're both quite important. It's also important to note from the fourth greenhouse gas study done for the IMO, this also identified that 30% of greenhouse gas emissions from the shipping industry come from domestic trade. So these are ferries, coastal traders, etc. And this also introduces an incentive from local policy to incentivize, give the carrot and stick for the shipping industry to decarbonize on a local side away from the auspices of the IMO. It's important also to note that industry is pushing this agenda and away from the IMO. And we have the Poseidon Principles, which is a group of the finance companies who currently represent about 40% of tonnage of shipping, who are agreeing that they will only finance their portfolio must sit below this line. And also we've got the Sea Cargo Charter with the same intentions from the chartering departments. So in order to achieve 2050, what we do know is that we need an energy transition. And it's important that this energy transition is going to move to zero carbon energy sources. And it's also important to note that this isn't about pushing the problem upstream. If we separate shipping into the fuel coming onto the vessel, so what we're referring to as well to tank, and then tank to wake from when it's on board the vessel to the propeller in terms of operational. We could achieve zero emissions from a shipboard side, from a tank to wake, but that could increase the CO2 emissions upstream compared to using HFO today. So the fuels we're talking about for zero carbon energy sources are displayed here. I'm not going to run through them all, but is a mixture of using natural gas with carbon capture systems, biomass potentially, and renewable electricity being the feedstock to creating what we term as e-fuels, which can be truly carbon neutral. Or sorry, zero carbon. So to put this into context as well, in terms of how the problem needs to be addressed, when we look at previous energy transitions, we had a case where if we look at, we had wind to coal and then coal to oil. If we examine the coal to oil transition, energy transition, we had a fuel oil which was then being widely traded, was abundant and was cheap, safe to handle, and had a high energy density, so easier to store on board. The fuels which I referred to earlier on the slide, in particular with ammonia, hydrogen, and methanol, the fuel is not abundant at the moment. it is not as safe to store, it's not as energy dense, and the cost of that fuel from the analysis done today is going to be 2 to 4 times more expensive than fuels of today. So really we need a regulatory framework to accelerate the use of these fuels. But it's not just about the use of the fuels, it's about the supply of the fuels and also the resources. They're not abundant today, and it's having the mechanisms in place. So moving on, we've done some work in this area talking about the subject, and these are available to download, the various papers talking about the subject in depth. This slide here is looking at the life cycle emissions of the various fuels, and there's various iteratives of this slide and the fuels. But what this is really highlighting is in the purple we have the onboard emissions, so tank to wake, and in the green we have the upstream emissions, well to tank perspective. And it's important that we look at this, and when we're talking about sustainability and fuels of tomorrow, that we're selecting the right fuels and looking also at their availability of the fuels for tomorrow. We'll also be moving to a transition where it's not going to be one single fuel for the shipping industry as we have today. It's going to be a mix of fuels. Again, coming back to when I talked about energy density and the problems of the future fuels, is we have HFO and MGO using predominantly today, LNG requiring twice as much volume as today's fuels, and the fuels being discussed for the future fuels are less energy dense. What does this mean? This means less cargo space, more fuel tank space, which potentially can lead to less cargo space. So these are all factors to consider from a operational point of view. Or the alternative is to bunker more frequently than a vessel currently does today. So moving on to this slide. So some of the analysis we have done for shipping owners has been looking at the fuels of tomorrow and how this actually impacts them from a financial point of view. So this is a 84K bulk carrier, and we modeled this on various fuels in comparison to HFO, and we took a high renewable electricity price when doing these results. And what we have here on this slide is we have the biofuels in the dotted line at the bottom, and over time these will increase in cost as they're unable to scale up as rapidly to meet demand, but also other industries will be adopting biofuels, which are also hard to abate. So their cost will rise as a normal supply and demand. But with the decreasing cost of renewable electricity, we will see the e-fuels drop in price. Now, this is important in terms of resilience in your business planning, in able to make the right decisions. So the right decision today may not be the right decision in 2030, and therefore it's having that holistic view to make the right decisions moving forward. And again, this is the same bulk carrier, and this was put into a different perspective and looking at the yearly cost. Again, we broke down the fuels in terms of cost of that fuel, in terms of the voyage cost, but also the impact which may have on the storage volume, but also the storage impact. So the larger storage impact leading to loss of cargo space and any additional cost. But what this really highlighted is we're moving from an era from today where CapEx is still quite a large issue, and the charterer is paying for the fuel, whereas in tomorrow, CapEx as a percentage is not going to be as much of a concern as OpEx. So it's going to be getting your operational fuel right, and then maybe even paying a premium for that at a new build stage or retrofit stage for a cost benefit. So to really give an overview of that from an investment point of view, the primary driver is fuel price. And so therefore this is OpEx, not CapEx. We need a carbon price to close a competitive gap between the fuels of today to the fuels of tomorrow to enable the transition to take place. otherwise polluter will pay. Technology, from a technology perspective, from the projects we've done to date, we know that the zero carbon fueled vessels are ready by 2024. We have projects in Korea where we're working with the engine manufacturer, etc., and they will have an engine ready by 2024 and a retrofit engine ready by 2025. So therefore, it's less about the technology for the ship. However, there are going to be significant safety challenges with the fuels of tomorrow, particularly with toxicity or flammability or explosiveness of the fuel. But the bulk of the technology challenge is also on the land infrastructure and the fuel production. The fuel production currently won't meet the demand of shipping, particularly if we're looking at green ammonia, green hydrogen, but also the infrastructure on land. And we're in an era of chicken and egg scenario. So it needs to work together. And then on a community side, we need the strong policy interventions to enable the investment to go ahead, which will then enable the technology to move forward. We need to look at life cycle emissions. That needs to be adopted into the policy, and the sustainability impacts of the fuels. Because what we're also wary of is the sustainability impact of a fuel. A fuel could be chosen, and then future legislation upon concerns about the sustainability of the fuel coming in. So a decision could be made today, which may not be useful tomorrow. So within Lloyd's Register, in the Maritime Decarbonisation Hub, we are looking at our projects as a mixture of technology readiness level, community readiness level, and investment readiness level. And we have we're building up a model on this of the Marine Solution Readiness Level model, which is taking into all of those, the key factors together. And how we're doing this, as a charitable organization sponsored by the Lloyd's Register Foundation, we're going to be sharing our work with the impacts of a safety for a sustainable future, safety at sea, safety of physical infrastructure, and public understanding of risk, as well as safety skills. But really breaking this down into investment, sustainability, safety, technology, and policy, and looking after all of those aspects to enable the investors, the ship owners, the charterers to make informed decisions. This is just an overview of some of the projects we've been doing to date. Recently announced was an approval in principle for EXMAR for an LPG carrier. We see smaller LPG carriers being an early adopter, because if they're carrying ammonia, which can be potentially used as a fuel, then it can burn this fuel. So it's going to remove the supply challenge, the infrastructure challenge, because it is trading in that fuel, and it can carry it as a cargo. So the supply challenge is removed. So that's seen as an early adopter. The Castor initiative is a mix of a ship owner, ourselves, a shipyard, and then more recently a fuel supplier, Yara, have come on board. And that's in conjunction with the Singapore flag as well. And this project is interesting because it's taking a multitude of stakeholders. This challenge can only be met through collaboration between multiple stakeholders. Other projects we're involved with as well are container ships and bulk carriers in particular. These are also seen as potential early adopters or early movers, particularly when on A to B shipping route, because there you can confirm or de-risk the supply chain and invest in a supply chain for that route. And that's critical to the early adopters. We need to see from 2030 to 2050 a very rapid scale up. But at the beginning, we need pilot projects which are scalable. So by this, I mean pilot projects where we can take learnings from we can show that they're commercially viable in the future, and then the learnings can be taken to extended routes or replicated on other routes. So if we look at policy, if we look at the ECA and SECA zones, they were areas which were then repeated in other areas of the world. What we don't want is policy going down the route of ballast water treatment systems, where we have one policy which conflicts with another policy and therefore delayed the whole process. Other areas we're working with from the Maritime Decarbonisation Hub, We're working with collaborative platforms and the ambitious collaborative platforms. So we're working with Getting to Zero and the Global Maritime Forum, but also the United Nations Compact and the Sustainable Shipping Initiative. We're working across policymakers, but then private sector partnerships. And these are important to get the ball rolling. So we can do the talking, which is on the left-hand side, the collaborative platforms, but the key part is the doing. And this is where we're continuously looking for ambitious partners to find a project, work together, and then move forward and address the challenges moving on in order that we can reach the 2050 ambitions. And thank you. And that's the end of my presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Charles. I think it really shows how important it is for us to decarbonise the shipping industry and not be left behind, as you said, with other sectors. And I completely agree that in order to reach a carbon neutral shipping industry, there's going to be a combination of fuels and a combination of technologies. There's not going to be one solution that fits everyone, and we really do need to consider the sustainability across the entire life cycle. So thank you very much for that. That was a brilliant presentation. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker for the day, Dr. Edmund Hughes from Green Marine Associates. Dr. Hughes is Director of Green Marine Associates Limited, a UK-based independent consultancy specialising in maritime policy development, regulatory implementation and management, and mitigation of risk with a focus on decarbonisation of ships. Previously, Dr. Hughes was Head of Air Pollution and Energy Efficiency in the Marine Environment Division of the IMO. As a member of the IMO Secretariat for over 9 years, his responsibilities covered MARPOL Annex 6, the international regulation for the prevention of air pollution from ships, including regulations on controlling emissions to air such as IMO 2020, energy efficiency for ships, and the IMO's work to address greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping, including the development and adoption of the initial IMO strategy on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships. Prior to joining the IMO, Dr. Hughes held roles in the United Kingdom Civil Service, including in HM Treasury, the UK's Finance and Economics Ministry, where he worked on risk management and corporate governance, and the UK's Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, where he held policy roles in safety management and environment and ballast water management and air pollution. Before that, he worked in academia researching engineering design and systems failure. He has a PhD and a degree from Cranfield University in the UK. I think you'll all agree with me, that's a pretty impressive CV. So thank you very much, Edmund. He will present to us today on alternative fuels for international shipping, regulatory drivers and challenges. So over to you, Edmund. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm also considerably older than most people, so that's probably why I've got an impressive CV. But I will now I'll share my screen so that people can see my presentation if I can find it. Where are we? No, I can't find my presentation. I'll try again. Is that showing now?
Yeah,
Thanks very much.
That's good now. Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies for that. Yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to share my views about alternative fuels for international shipping, in particularly focusing on the regulatory drivers and the challenges. I'm not able to speak very much about the UK position, but I will refer to it later in my presentation. But I certainly am aware of what is going on here in the UK and able to provide some input and insight on that. But as I say, my focus is really on the international situation, and the other speakers I know will allude to what is going on internationally. I think it's fair to say that what happens at the international level is really will drive many changes going on in shipping. But as again, as Charles alluded to, the domestic shipping is a real potential source of change for decarbonisation, not least the fact that many of the technologies and the fuels will be applied at a domestic level before they are applied internationally, primarily because it's close to the source of the fuel. To go forward, in terms of the shipping sector, just to briefly outline the role it has in terms of sustainable development, and I think it's worth remembering that that over 80% of global trade by volume and more than 70% of its value is carried on board ships, and that world seaboard trade volumes expanded by 0.5% to reach over 11 billion tons of cargo in 2019. Both these figures come from UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and demonstrate once again not only the importance of shipping to trade, but also the fantastic success story that shipping has been over the last 50 years. That figure for cargo carried has quadrupled in that period, and really shows you the developments that have gone on in international shipping to support frankly, globalization and the way the global economy exists today. We are seeing continued growth in that sector. That is why there is pressure and scrutiny to reduce the carbon emissions in the sector. But obviously, we've had the COVID pandemic last year, which has had a knock-on effect to international trade. But UNCTAD are already predicting that trade will recover and continue to grow. For those of you who don't know the IMO, just a brief overview there. It is a specialized agency of the United Nations. There's 174 member states and 3 associate members. Consultative organizations participate in the discussion, including the International Chamber of Shipping, the International Bunker Industry Association, IPECA, and OCIMF, who in various guises represent the energy industry. The function of the organization is to develop and maintain a comprehensive regulatory framework for international shipping, covering safety. The history of IMO is the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, which goes back to its roots, the Titanic accident in 1912. But very much now the focus is on the environment and the environmental impact of shipping. And that is where we are seeing significant deliberations going on, not least on greenhouse gases. And in fact, Emma alluded to the IMO 2020 rule on sulfur that came in on the 1st of January 2020, and the significant impact that had not only in terms of the fuels that ships use, but also the environment. Most of the discussion occurs on the environmental aspects under the Marine Environmental Protection Committee and the major conventions, MARPOL and Ballast Water, for example. And then the Maritime Safety Committee, of course, is responsible for SOLAS and the STCW, the Training Certification Convention. And it's fair to say that many of the issues resulting from decarbonisation of ships, as Charles again alluded to, will require safety considerations. And so there's going to have to be increasing amount of work, probably in the Safety Committee, to address any risks arising from the use of those alternative fuels. But going back to decarbonisation and really the trigger for IMO's work, I mean, IMO's been considering decarbonisation for many years, but the current situation is really a result of the Paris Agreement in 2015, which essentially set a carbon budget for the globe, and a carbon budget, frankly, which many feel we're already well overdrawn on. And to achieve, while shipping is not included in the Paris Agreement explicitly, it does refer to anthropogenic sources of carbon emissions. And so, there is no doubt about it that shipping has to contribute appropriately and fully to the goals of the Paris Agreement, and keeping those temperature goals in mind at all times. And to that extent, what was the result? Was in 2018, the adoption of the initial greenhouse gas strategy. As I said, others will allude to that during these presentations, so I won't go into too much detail, but I think it's important to highlight in particular the vision in the strategy, which says that IMO remains committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping, which reflects work that's already been done on energy efficiency, but as a matter of urgency, aims to phase them out as soon as possible in this century. So whilst there is a lot of focus on 2050 and the at least, the at least 50% reduction in emissions by 2050, the fact is that there is a goal to actually decarbonize the sector by the end of the century. So within 80 years, to have zero carbons from emitted from the sector, and that is an enormous challenge. And the levels of ambition that are set out in the initial strategy, as shown here, are a sort of roadmap towards achieving that, with an initial focus on carbon intensity, reducing the carbon intensity of shipping, but then moving on to essentially moving away from hydrocarbon fuels. This is a sector that uses some 300 million tons of hydrocarbon fuels per year. So you can see why it's an enormous challenge for the sector to move to alternative fuels, particularly low and zero carbon fuels. And I think it's it's also worth remembering here that ships, unlike many other sectors, and this is why it's a very hard to abate sector, has to carry its own fuel. A ship has to carry its own fuel to be able to carry out its service. And that is an enormous challenge, because as Charles alluded in some of his figures, he demonstrated that the energy density of some of the fuels that are being considered about is far less than currently the hydrocarbons that are used, which has implications for cargo carrying capacity and voyage range. Where we are today, as I said, I won't go into this too much detail, but you can see that there's been a focus on new ships and the energy efficiency of new ships. We're leading to an improvement in the design of those vessels, and now increasingly the impact is, or the focus is on the existing fleet. I've alluded here to also, in fact, to the initial IMO strategy, and of course there was a program of follow-up action which is ongoing at the moment at the IMO. But also importantly, there was an agreement that any measures that are taken should be, the impacts on states has to be fully considered and assessed before those measures are adopted. And this is very important, because the measures were seen as potentially restricting shipping activity and therefore having a knock-on impact to trade. I won't, as I said, this just alludes to those short-term measures which have been discussed and approved for, and will be considered for adoption in June by the Marine Environmental Protection Committee. There will be an energy efficiency existing ship index. This is essentially a technical measure to sort of to reduce to enhance the energy efficiency of an existing ship. There's also a focus on the carbon intensity with the introduction of carbon intensity indicators, whereby ships will be rated A to E to see what carbon intensity they are, and also enhancing the ship energy efficiency management plan of the vessel. But the key focus really is going to be on mid to long-term measures to get decarbonisation of the sector, and it's recognised that these are needed to achieve that goal. Currently, and as set out in the ambition, it says in the caveat to the levels of ambition, technological innovation and the global introduction of alternative fuels and/or energy sources will be integral to achieve the overall ambition. So business as usual is not going to be possible. We will need to introduce alternative fuels and alternative energy sources if we're going to achieve this goal. At the moment, one of the short-term measures that's been alluded to is the International Maritime Research and Development Board, which is a proposal initially made by industry, but now has been submitted to the MEPC in June for consideration. This would be a fund, a $2 per tonne of fuel would be applied to provide funds to enable research and development, which is seen as critical to support achieving the goals in the strategy. But it's important that we whenever we go forward, that also life cycle considerations are considered. Historically, the regulations have looked at tank to wake issues. That is, you take the fuel from the tank and you burn it in the engine, and then you look at the emissions from the fuel stack, from the ship stack, the funnel. But increasingly and importantly, there is a need to look at well to wake. So we have to look at the upstream emissions and make sure that we're not just transferring one environmental problem to another area. It is not going to be satisfactory to do that going forward. The sustainability of those fuels is critical. What is the feedstock? If you're looking at biofuels, first generation biofuels are heavily criticized because they were seen as damaging the environment as land was cleared to produce those fuels. Again, that won't be acceptable going forward because it's just seen as unacceptable from a policy point of view. There's also a need to ensure that any energy that's used to produce those fuels is sustainable. So again, burning carbon-based fuels to produce these alternative zero and low carbon fuels, again, would not be seen as acceptable. It's not aiding in terms of, as I explained before, we have a finite carbon budget. So we have to make sure that if we are producing fuels, at least they're net zero in terms of carbon emissions. And scale, and this is critical. This was a key issue of the consideration of the IMO 2020 rule. We have to make sure that fuel is available globally for an industry that operates globally. We need ships, and whilst it may be that ships on scheduled routes can operate to find fuels, we need to also ensure that the many ships that operate on what we call the tramp trade, non-scheduled routes, such as bulk carriers, oil tankers, they need to be able to have access to fuel supplies as well. And again, that is a critical part. Indeed, the whole infrastructure issue is a significant challenge and a barrier for this matter. And in fact, the Global Maritime Forum has identified that you know of the investment needed, about over 80% is going to be required on the land to provide the infrastructure to supply these fuels, and they were talking in terms of $1 to 1.4 trillion US dollars just to achieve the 2050 goals. So as you can see, it's a significant challenge to achieve this supply of these fuels. How are we going to do that? Well, one of the critical things is to look at the carbon price and the differential between carbon-based fuels and non-carbon-based fuels. And frankly, without a market-based measure, I don't see how that gap, that spread can be narrowed. At the moment, zero carbon-based fuels are cheaper and remain so, and will remain so unless there is some market intervention to change that. So what we are looking at is a fourth propulsion revolution, and at the moment there are many options being considered of fuels, hydrogen, ammonia, obviously battery technology for short sea. But the fact is, as I said before, the carbon price is going to be critical. Even a nuclear power, that is not often talked about, but nuclear power, particularly advanced nuclear reactors, small modular reactors, which are using molten salts as a fuel, potentially have the option, could not necessarily be used to propel the vessels, but be used to produce as it's zero carbon energy, to produce those electric fuels that will be used on the ship. As I said before, the key issues when it comes to energy for shipping is going to be the scale, the sustainability, and the life cycle considerations, and these cannot be dismissed readily. And in fact, the IMO, as part of the work program, will be looking at life cycle and developing guidelines for the life cycle of fuels that are going to be used by ships going forward. Just to allude to work that's been going on from a point of the collaboration side of things, is recognized, fully recognized at the IMO that these fuels cannot be delivered without collaborative action between national governments and the shipping sector. And there's been a significant focus on not just the fuels, but also the ports, who will therefore be primary suppliers of these fuels, but also the development of policies within nation states to deliver and develop those fuels as part of their overall energy policy. And I think that's a very important part to note, is that these fuels that are going to be developed will be developed on the back of the energy transition that's going on by all member governments to achieve their goals under the Paris Agreement. And I think this slide just shows you that there's been work looking at what national action plans can be developed to address the issue, and one of those has been by the UK. The UK has developed a clean maritime plan, which identifies, for example, that they want new ships operating domestically to be zero carbon capable from 2025. And there's also a joined up thinking going on in terms of future energy supply to the sector, and where that supply will come from, with a focus on hydrogen hubs and also small scale nuclear reactors to produce the energy, as I said, that is zero carbon. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for your attention, and I very much appreciate looking forward to your comments and questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edmund. That's fantastic. I think you give us a really good overview of what's happening both internationally and within the UK. And as you said, 300 million tonnes of fuel a year is a lot of fuel, and I think that's one of the reasons the sector is so difficult to decarbonise. But I think the capability is there, and it's through working together globally that we're going to achieve this. So I think that's why forums like this are so important. So thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Vice Admiral Alessandro Corsini. And again, I apologise for the pronunciation of your name. Corsino has a 34-year career in the Brazilian Navy. Currently, he holds the position of Director of Ports and Coasts and is responsible for acting in the area of water traffic safety, in the maritime professional education system, standardizing and supervising the environmental management of the military organizations of the Brazilian Navy, monitoring maritime policies and resolutions issued by the IMO. And this is all in addition to performing the process management and functional supervision of the 68 captaincies, police stations and agencies throughout the national territory. Vice Admiral Cassino will present on how the Brazilian Maritime Authority are committed to a sustainable future. And if I could just remind all the attendees that if you have any questions for the speakers, pop them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll come to those once all the presenters have spoken. But for now, over to you, Vice Admiral. Thank you very much.
Well, Emma, good morning for you, for other speakers as well, and ladies and gentlemen from the audience. It's a great honor to be here representing the Brazilian Maritime Authority. So to make most of our time, I will show up the presentation. Well, we are going to follow two topics. The first is a reflection about where is our future, a brief presentation about our structure as well, some comments about the strategy in terms of GHG emissions, what we see about the international charge as well, the Brazilian contributions, possibilities about cooperation between Brazil and the UK, and a brief conclusion. So as we see, I mean, we have a huge country also with huge responsibility, not to just for our people, but to the world as well. So that's our structure. We have, I mean, two main sites. One is in Brasilia, where is our general staff, and where are also our representative of 8 ministries, And also we have site in Rio, the DPC, the Director of Ports and Coasts. So here inside our structure in Rio, we have, I mean, a executive secretary for IMO's matters, and also superintendents in terms of marine, seafarers, and environment. And also we are responsible for maritime education in the whole country. So well, of course, it has been presented for other speakers, but it's also important to emphasize that the IMO's strategy in terms of reduction, there are basically in three main, pillars: the energy efficiency, the reduction of CO2 emissions for, per transport work, and also in terms of total annual reduction. So that is our goal in terms of 2050. We have at least 50% of reduction. What are our challenges? The international challenges. Well, we have, in terms of short terms, we think that the main concern is about the indicators that we have to produce, that we have to develop together. And in terms of mid-term measures, we think that we have to put our focus in terms of what will be the technological innovations and trying to allow we follow our targets. So what is also much important to not to cause major distortion in terms of the markets. And about long-term measures, yes, we have to develop low and zero carbon technological fuels, but we also have to be very concerned about the impacts, mainly in terms of small island development states and the least developed countries as well, because we have 174 countries and everyone has to be cared of. So what are the Brazilian contributions for so much important goal and also challenge? In terms of short term, if we follow the same classification that I have shown before, we could say that here we are developing some studies, mainly in our university in São Paulo, lectures about low carbon fuel technology here in our university in Rio. And also we are very pleased to join the steering committee for evaluating tax work in terms of impact in every state. So we talking about the midterm measures. We think that we have to integrate every group that will be, installed or proposed for studying the carbon intensity, mainly about the efficiency. And also we in China, we have proposed some rating mechanisms in terms of to be mandatory measure to reduce the intensity for international shipping. Well, we could say that we have some proposals. The Brazilian Maritime Authority thinks that we have to use findings for the fourth IMO study in order to have a better assessment in terms of shipping emissions. We should use a data collection system for giving us better information based in better database. We also have to join adoption of technical and operational indicators. That's our main suggestion. For enabling us the real energy efficiency for ships, for each kind of ship. We also think that it would be better if we adopt rating mechanism in terms of contributing for implementation of those measures. So, but we also have some things, some reflections that we should be, very keen about what would be the better option if it is in terms of market or, in terms of the ship itself. So we also think that we have to reflect about the adoption of measures in terms of the impact on the states to make easier and better and also, more acceptable for adoption for those countries. And also those values should be, stabilized more than in terms of goal than measures. So it could give us a better flexibility for those adoption. So how is our industry in terms of the low sulfur fuel? We also produced around 5.6 million of VLS SFO. We have supplied for 17 national ports. We started in April 2019, and we think that the market will be about 1.6 million in 2020, and basically to Asia. And we exported around 8.7 million fuel by the IMO requirements. So we also put on the market, Brazilian market letter, specifically about the SOx fuel. So what are the possibilities that we see between Brazil and the UK? We think that the oil and gas industry is very good perspective, because we could think in terms of prospecting production those specific kind of oil. Also, we can share some knowledge about the marine fuels. I saw Mr. Hawkins when he talking about the maritime decarbonization hub, and he spoke about the, for example, the methanol fuel. We also have a very importance of methanol in our energy matrix, because our cars are using this kind of fuel for so long time. So we also think that we can share knowledge about the modeling and carbon neutral or what another kind of fuel for using in maritime markets. But we also think that the possibilities for cooperation in Brazil and UK could be done in another subject of such important concern of maritime industry in terms of environment sustainability. That is, we can work together in IMO, for example, trying to put the whole countries against the environment threats that are also so much important as the GHG innovation. So you know that in 2019 we have a very big accident in Brazilian coast. It was an unprecedented incident in the world. It's around 5,300 tons that were collected by our people. The Maritime Authority and regional environment agencies work together, and we also intend to propose an amendment for Chapter 5 of SOLAS, and trying to make it easier for every country to monitorize the ships it is sailing around their coast. So, and it was an unprecedented incident, but 2 months ago, it is still, sorry, 2 months, a few weeks ago, we had a very similar accident in Israel, and so we think that we need to think not just in terms of GHG, but we have to make a conversion to another kind of threats in terms of environment sustainability, and it is a huge impact when we have an accident, as we had in Brazil 2019. So our conclusion about the first question, our future is in Blue Amazon, but we think that it should be done in terms of sustainable actions, and GEG is one of them. Another is our suggestions for amendment in terms of Chapter 5 of SOLAS. But in terms of, IMO arena, or the cooperation between countries, that's our suggestion. We believe that that is the answer. A huge effort, continue to participate for international cooperation and support. So that's our, what we say in Brazil and in DPC. We work for safe and clean seas and rivers. And I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and together with so remarkable speakers. And well, thank you very much for everyone for the attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Admiral, for a fantastic presentation. I think it's really interesting to hear what the Brazilian Maritime Authority are doing to meet the IMO regulations and to compare that with what we're doing here in the UK. And as you said, there's so many opportunities for collaboration between Brazil and the UK and many other countries internationally as well. So thank you very much for that brilliant presentation. I'm now pleased to introduce you to our fourth and final speaker for today. Dr. Lavinia Hollander, CFA, is the Senior Transport Consultant at ICS. She's the founder and Managing Director of Escopa Energica. I'm sure she'll correct my pronunciation there, but an energy and infrastructure consulting firm. She has been head of research at the Centre for Energy Studies at FGV, where she coordinated a high-level research team, as well as produced articles and studies on the energy sector. She used to work in the financial market for 10 years as an equity analyst in the electricity, oil and gas, water and other regulated sectors. She is a member of the board of directors of Eneva since 2018, where she coordinates the investment committee. Lavinia is an advisor of the Brazilian delegation in the Marine Environment Protection Committee, MEPC, at the IMO. Lavinia will present a Brazilian perspective on alternative low carbon fuels for shipping. So thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Emma. And you did a great job with the pronunciation. And my name is very hard to pronounce, so even for Brazilians. So thanks, everybody, and good morning and good afternoon. I am Lavinia Hollander. I'm a shipping consultant for Institute for Climate and Society. So I'll share my presentation here. Just a second. Yeah, I think it's working. So let me start by presenting, first of all, let me start by thanking my colleagues for excellent presentations. And I think what they presented before is going to make my presentation shorter and more straight to the point. So thanks a lot. Let me start by presenting who we are. So the Institute for Climate and Society is a Brazilian philanthropic organization that promotes prosperity, justice, and low carbon development in Brazil. And one of the main activities of the Institute is to promote and sponsor studies, projects, and organizations that seek to provide technical evidence to support decision makers. Particularly on the shipping sector, on behalf of the Institute, I'm an advisor of the Brazilian delegation in MEPC. The focus we give is on alternative fuels for shipping. So we've heard about IMO's ambitions and decarbonization debate and new alternative fuels. So what I will try to present in the next few slides is the Brazilian perspective, rather our perspective on candidates for alternative fuels for international shipping sector, considering the Brazilian landscape and the Brazilian perspective. So before we get to the alternative fuels, let me try to show you what is the export profile of Brazil and try to illustrate how it can affect the debate on shipping decarbonization in Brazil, and possibly in Latin America, since most of Latin American countries share a similar export profile that Brazil does. So Brazil is the largest country in Latin America and exports mainly low added value products, including grains and other agricultural commodities, and also crude oil and iron ore. So those products, they usually travel over very long distance, and Brazilian exporters, they seek to win on scale. China is the main destination for Brazilian export in mass transported, and the long distances usually result in more emissions per ton transported. What the graph shows is that about 3/4 of the transported mass corresponds to only 1/4 of the exported value of Brazilian exports. So relatively to some of the country's competitors, Brazil is in a kind of a geographical disadvantage. This is the case of, for example, iron ore exports, where Brazil competes with Australia, and which is much closer to the main market, which is China. And from the Brazilian perspective, shipping decarbonization might mean additional costs and less competitiveness for exports. Well, on the other hand, we do believe and strongly believe that there's also a very positive agenda in decarbonizing the shipping sector for Brazil. And this is very important to us to explore potential gains for the country from the shipping decarbonization and potential comparative advantages that Brazil might have in this decarbonization of the shipping sector. And one of the answers for us for building this positive agenda is fuel technology. So what we need to make sure is whatever options we have in Brazil and whatever options Brazil considers as an alternative for shipping fuels is truly sustainable. So in the following slides, I'll show some of those options that are being discussed and considered, and what is the views we have on positives and negative aspects of those alternatives. Well, number one, natural gas. So natural gas was mentioned in the previous presentations as an alternative, is being considered. Brazilian natural gas production is expected to increase significantly in the next 10 years, mainly from the pre-salt, which is considered an exceptional geological asset, very productive, and one of the key areas in the global portfolio of IOCs, international oil companies. So most of the current and future natural gas production in Brazil comes from associated gas, so it's associated with oil, which means that the economics of the production is mostly related to the oil production, not to the gas production. And in addition to that, the infrastructure needed to transport the gas from offshore, the production area, to the coast is quite expensive, and it's mostly yet to be built. So we still need investments to bring, to build this infrastructure. Well, we know that on the potential positive side for natural gas, natural gas has no sulfur content, so it complies with IMO 2020, and relatively to other alternatives, it has attractive prices. I think Charles mentioned this. I don't remember who mentioned, but someone mentioned this before. On the other hand, there are several shortcomings for LNG or natural gas as an option for decarbonization. Well, number one, and the most important, is it will not do the job in terms of reaching the targets for many reasons, including methane slip, which is a gas with a global warming potential about 30 times higher than CO2. And I think both Charles and Dr. Edmond mentioned or had a slide showing emissions for different fuels, and we could see how natural gas performs in terms of life cycle emissions. Also, something that was mentioned, low energy density, which increases storage requirements for vessels. And remember, we need to cross very long distances. And finally, and one thing that's very important for Brazil, we still have to build the infrastructure. So once we commit lots of money and investments to the LNG infrastructure, it is sunk. And it means that we'll be committed to this infrastructure for decades. So this would mean billions of dollars, which could otherwise be invested in building more, let's say, more modern and green infrastructure. So I remember Charles mentioning that whatever is a good decision today might not be a good decision in the future. So that's what I'm talking about. So we need to invest in infrastructure that will not likely be stranded within the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. So the second one is biofuels. So as much as I know how controversial biofuels might be, it is hard not to consider biofuels for shipping or in Brazil as an alternative for Brazil. We are the second largest biofuel producer in the world, just behind the US. We have developed in the past technology for first generation biofuels used for light vehicles. So currently, nearly all our fleet use either gasoline or ethanol. But biofuels is a rather large umbrella. So from a technical and economic standpoint, there are some advantages for Brazil in considering biofuels for shipping. And I can just mention some of them. Well, Brazil knows how to produce biofuels, and there are several research projects in Brazil for advanced biofuels. The country has a large agricultural production and potential for bioenergy. There's also potential for to use biomass residues as a feedstock for biofuels. And one thing that I think is very important, some of the biofuels are drop-in alternatives, meaning they are ready to be used and with little or no need to adapt the vessels. Well, there's the shortcomings also for biofuels. Biofuels, yes, they might have direct or indirect land use impacts, which means it can lead directly to or indirectly to deforestation, which is an effect that we need to pay a lot of attention to. Biomass production is dispersed, so within the Brazilian territory. So it's logistic, it's going to be a challenge. And also scale, which is something that Dr. Edmond mentioned as well. Scale is going to be a challenge for Brazil. There's not much potential to maintain a large-scale sustainable supply of biofuels for shipping. So the main message here is we do need to be careful when discussing biofuels for shipping. If biofuels are to be considered, we need to make sure they are sustainable. But in a country like Brazil, or even in other countries in Latin America, such as Argentina, it's probably nearly impossible to leave biofuels off the table. So this is something we need to consider. And last but not least, electrofuels. So now electrofuels is where we get to the very positive agenda, in our view, for shipping decarbonization in Brazil. And some examples of electrofuels were mentioned before, include green hydrogen, green ammonia, as well as green e-diesel. So e-fuels need electricity to be produced, and by green we mean clean energy producing using renewable energy. We do acknowledge that, generally speaking, e-fuels present important shortcomings in terms of technological readiness, costs, and use of water, and also for green hydrogen and ammonia. One of the main challenges for a Latin American country is the low energy density, which means it would require really high tank capacity for using them as a fuel to travel long distances. However, the technology is rapidly evolving, and Brazil has not yet fully considered its full potential or full advantages in the production of electrofuels. And I'll just mention some of them. Number one, that Brazil has a relatively clean electricity mix mix compared to the rest of the world. So nearly 80% of our installed capacity in generating electricity is renewable in Brazil. And there's more to come, especially in wind and solar. Wind capacity in Brazil has grown from 0 to 15 gigawatts in the past 10 years, all onshore. So that means that there's still a large potential, not only onshore, but offshore as well, for wind, additional wind capacity in Brazil. There's also a large potential for solar energy, still largely untapped in Brazil. And finally, Brazil has a highly interconnected electric transmission system, which means you can produce renewable energy virtually anywhere, or not necessarily near the e-fuels production plant, and just inject into the grid and use this renewable energy. Some points to be considered in terms of developing this electrofuels agenda for Brazil. Well, Brazil probably does not have the resources to invest in research and development for this new technology. So I see lots of potential for collaboration. And the other thing is something that was already mentioned, infrastructure. So Brazil, like other Latin American countries, has a very stringent fiscal situation. So it might be quite difficult to be the early adopter of a new technology with all the investment needs for, not only for investment in research and development but also for investment in the infrastructure associated with this new technology. But I do see lots of potential for collaboration. So one thing we did to provide further information on alternative fuels for shipping, one thing the Institute for Climate and Society did is we commissioned a scientific study conducted by Synergia Lab, one of the research branches of the COPE of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. The study was conducted and coordinated by Professors Alexandre Sclo and Roberto Schaffer. The research performs the analysis of decarbonization alternatives for the international shipping sector based on renewable fuels from the Brazilian perspective. So our intention is to promote the debate and see how we can contribute to this debate. So the study was conducted in 3 sequential phases. The first phase of the study listed the 5 most suitable fuels to help achieve IMO targets according to a set of criteria such as applicability, environmental sustainability, cost, etc. The second phase of the study, a more in-depth assessment of those 5 fuels was presented to map the Brazilian production potential and to estimate emissions of GHG and life cycle emissions of those fuels. And the third phase of the project performed an economic analysis, or an integrated analysis of those fuels. So just my last slide, just the key takeaways of those study. It was finalized in the second half of last year and published in the scientific journal Energy. The results of the integrated analysis show some synergy between IMO 2050 and national decarbonization efforts. So actually, yes, decarbonization is not only a shipping problem, and also because alternative fuels for shipping can be co-products from other sectors. The integrated analysis also showed that achieving IMO targets require an integrated mitigation response across sectors. Otherwise, we can have spillover effects and emissions. It's also important that alternative fuels are certified to guarantee low or zero life cycle emissions. And we do believe that Brazil has some advantages to kick off the production of low emission alternative fuels due to this high availability of natural resources, and is favorable to the production of alternative fuels. But we probably need strong incentives or mandates to make them competitive. So those are the main points I'd like to bring. And I think I finished my presentation, Emma. Yes. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to present.
Brilliant, thank you so much. It's quite nice to hear about the overlaps that already exist between Brazil and the UK. And I'm also quite interested to hear about the advancements for renewables in Brazil as well. And I think the opportunity for solar is definitely much better in Brazil than, than it is in the UK. But again, the common theme through all these presentations has been the need for collaboration. So thank you very much to all of you for your brilliant presentations. I'd now like to start the Q&A session. So if I can invite all the speakers to turn their cameras on for that. We are running a few minutes behind schedule, so we'll see how we get on, but we might extend the session by five or so minutes just to get a few more of the questions answered. But we'll see how we get on. I'll just wait for the speakers to turn their cameras on. Brilliant. Okay, so the first question, Charles, is for you. How can technology support the emission reduction in the long term? And what do you think the cutting edge technology will be commercially and economically available?
Thank you, Emma. It's a good question. I think to break down technology and where we use it, if we look at today's and the immediate need moving up to 2030 is, and particularly EEXI, is for energy efficiency devices. And these have been around for a while. I mean, if we look at Flettner rotors, for example, they're around in the 1920s and they're making a comeback today. And there's a series of these devices which need to be rolled out now in order to mature them further by the time we're adopting the zero carbon fuels. The economic model may not work for them today, but they'll certainly work with them tomorrow. The key is to get them mature today, get them integrated into the ship's design, but also not just looking at hardware, but also looking at software. Just-in-time arrival, operational efficiencies are all key to getting right now before we move into the era of more expensive fuels, so that we can use less of them. And that will also mean the earlier adoption. Cutting edge technology, it's going to be, I mean, it's difficult to say at the moment because the fuels are coming into play. We're seeing the adoption of current technology, two-stroke main engines being adopted for ammonia. We're seeing four-stroke engines for hydrogen, but we're also seeing fuel cells, and the fuel cell development is going to be key. Particularly, say, solid oxide fuel cells could potentially be fuel agnostic, allow a mix, say, moving from LNG to hydrogen. So that's good, and potentially offering very good efficiencies. So that's going to be one part. I think the real key cutting edge technology will be on the land-based systems and on the electrolyzer side. So how can we produce the fuel more cheaply when we look at the cost of production for hydrogen, and even hydrogen being the main molecule for producing all the other e-fuels, is if we can reduce the electrolyzer cost and the electricity cost of those fuels, that will bring down the cost significantly. So shipboard side, yes, we can make advances in technology to create savings, but I think the catalyst to this will be savings on the shore-based side and the production side of the fuels.
Brilliant, thank you. I can see Lavinia's nodding as well, so hopefully she agrees with you. So next question for you, Lavinia. How do you think society can contribute to raising awareness for IMO's targets, and how can that have an impact at a national level?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good question, because the debate on IMO targets and shipping decarbonization in Brazil has been very restricted to this point to the Maritime Authority and to some players in Brazil who are closer to the subject. I do believe that we should involve more players, more people involved that are closer, that, for example, other exporters, the agricultural sector as well. So I do think that, to give a short answer, the private sector should be more involved and could be more involved in this debate, and not only a small part of the private sector. So I think this will be will increase awareness. And the second stakeholder that I think would be, helpful in this debate is other branches of the government, for example, and this is happening already. The Ministry of Energy and other organizations or government organizations linked to the energy sector. That is happening already. We are seeing more interest from those stakeholders, and I think this will help bring, more awareness.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, so we've got a question here for all the panelists, but I think I'll come to Edmund first and then see if anyone else wants to comment afterwards. So they'd appreciate an opinion on the main barriers to accelerate the technical and commercial readiness level for the different alternative fuels. So despite the cost and availability, and then considering the future marine fuels will probably be a mix of alternative fuels, what are the most promising ones for 2050? Edmund, I don't know if you have comment on that.
Again, the speakers before me have all sort of alluded to the various potential fuels and the potential reasons why there are barriers. I think for me, a lot of the for shipping in particular, shipping is just another sector, and it has to recognise that it is essentially a receiver of fuel. It doesn't generate the fuel and make those fuels, and this is why the whole issue of collaboration and engagement with other authorities and wider stakeholders is so important, because unless you raise that awareness with those, they're not going to understand the challenges for shipping. I alluded to them in my presentation about the fact that ships carry their own fuel. But I think the fact is that we have to have those conversations, and it's why, going back to what I said about the national action plans, is important, and it may be that something Brazil needs to could consider for shipping, both domestic and international, and because it does provide that conversation, with the stakeholders internally and external. And we've seen already in shipping, for example, the cargo carriers, the charterers, and the ship owners, they're already very heavily involved in proposals being submitted. For example, the Sea Cargo Charter, the Poseidon Principles. We had the industry leading on the research fund, which is potentially going to raise, if it goes forward, $5 billion over 10 years for R&D. So there's already very much great interest with the stakeholder groups in shipping, but it's the external stakeholders as well which need engaging with, and I think that is what is critical. I would also say, I think the thing about when in my presentation, I didn't really sort of focus in on any particular fuel as the solution. I think I certainly think biofuels are a potential solution in the short term, because they are a drop-in fuel. Essentially, you just replacing hydrocarbons that we have with a biofuel, and they achieve many of the environmental goals we need. But the problem for shipping is that they're going to be competing in the market against other sectors such as aviation, and aviation will have deeper pockets, than shipping. And so shipping is going to lose out in the longer term because they won't be able to compete for those fuels. So it has to look at other solutions in the longer term. Thank you.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Do any of the other three of you want to comment on that, or Charles? Yeah, of course.
I think to come on the question on the main barriers to accelerate the technical and commercial readiness is policy and long-term policy. At the moment, it's very difficult for investors to make a decision moving forwards, looking at 2030, 2040, 2050. A ship has a lifetime of say 25 years. A cruise ship has a lifespan of 40 years, and they're making decisions today to build a vessel which will be around by 2050 potentially. So they need that certainty, and it's creating a bit of an issue at the moment. We've got short-term policy for EEXI, but we do need that clear long-term policy in writing as soon as possible to allow it to move ahead. In terms of the fuels of the future, I think we're we're not going to see one fuel, we're going to see a multiple of fuels, and it's going to be how they adapted and how operations change around this. We talked, one of the panelists talked before about tramp shipping. It is going to be a harder to abate, and it's not going to be a light switch moment in 2049 on December the 30th, like the sulfur cap or anything else. It has to be a transition. It is an energy transition. So we know what the end picture looks like, but painting that picture is going to be very difficult. So it's going to be how do we have the transition pathways to get there? Tramp shipping won't be an early adopter. They'll be one of the last ones. We've got to get those A to B routes and the easy to abate ones rolled out first. And certainly Brazil, with the iron ore trade, etc., is in a very good position for that A to B routes, because it then sort of really makes the supply and the infrastructure part easier.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Edmund, go on.
Sorry, if I may come back and just say, I think whilst we want to focus obviously on the mid to long term, and I did in my own presentation, and I'm still doing anyone looking over the horizon, I think we do need to focus initially on the energy efficiency measures, and particularly the carbon intensity reduction measures that are being considered by the IMO at the moment, because essentially the reason why they're important is by reducing the carbon intensity of the sector, both new ships, but now increasingly existing ships as well. That will make it easier for that transition. You know, there's going to be less, therefore, there's going to be less demand for fuels because the ships will be more energy efficient and operating more effectively. And I think that again is a very important transition. Part of the transition is that we do ensure that we have essentially picked the low-hanging fruit in terms of energy efficiency but up to 2030 before we then move into this sort of new phase of alternative fuels. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Emma, can I add, just agreeing with my colleagues, but I would add from a developing country perspective, also finance and capacity building as well for, you know, the development of new technologies, deployment of new technologies in developing countries.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much. Now there's a question for you, Vice Admiral. Could the royalties of the oil and gas sector be used to support R&D in this area?
Well, Emma, thank you very much for the question. I mean, education is also the main concern of everyone. And well, in terms of, I mean, legality, we have a very intricate, I mean, tax structure and regulation. So the answer directly is no. We can't use the royalties because they are mainly directed to the health structure of the government. But we have, on the other hand, we have an opportunity in terms of using the fundings from the oil industry to, I mean, give to the education sector the opportunity to build up some ideas and technology as well. So, I mean, by the government, by the royalties, because of our tax structure, no, but we also have some roads to, I mean, pick the money from the oil industry to, I mean, to give to the educational industry and educational universities as well, as we saw by Dr. Lavinia presentation and by my data as well, opportunities for universities in São Paulo or Rio, supported by the oil industry funds to build such kind of knowledge. Okay, thank you.
Emma, if I may add to that, I think the main point is, no, we can't use royalties, but there is a regulation in the oil sector in Brazil saying that 1% of revenues from the oil sector in Brazil has to be invested in R&D in Brazil. So this amount usually is used, it's invested in universities or partnerships between, you know, the companies and universities in Brazil. And these resources could be used to, you know, research new technologies or new fuel technologies or more efficient fuel technologies for decarbonization.
Brilliant,
Thank you, Dr. Lavinia, for your add. Very important. Thank you.
And then another question, which I suppose goes to both of you in Brazil, but it would be interesting to learn a bit more about Brazil's investment opportunities to research and partnerships on finding solutions for emissions reduction. So maybe the last question covered that a little bit, but could you maybe expand on the investment opportunities that there are in Brazil? I don't know who wants to go first.
Can I start? Yeah. No. I mentioned some of those in my presentation, but I do think that I've been hearing many people interested in know more about the renewable potential in Brazil, because Brazil might be an interesting hub for production of green ammonia or green hydrogen, especially because of the kind of grid we have. And so I do think that there's lots of opportunities for building this, what I call this positive agenda on e-fuels. And I think we still have, we still haven't seen many projects just being in place in Brazil and being developed here. So I think this is the main opportunities. We might see other opportunities in other types of fuels, but I think e-fuels might be, you know, the low-hanging fruit in terms of research and development in Brazil.
Brilliant, thank you. Vice Admiral, do you want to add to that, or are you happy with the answer?
Oh, thank you. Dr. Lavinia was perfect. Not bad. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm aware that it is past, but if all the speakers are okay, I just have one last question that I'd like to pose to all of you, and then I'll hand back to Laura for the closing remarks. So obviously we've heard a lot about collaboration today, and I think the importance of that in meeting the IMO regulations is obvious to all of us, and that's why we're here. But I guess to the English side, what have you learned from what's going on in Brazil, and to the Brazilian side, what have you learned from what's going on in the UK today? Just a brief remark from all of you on that, if that's okay. Edmund, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Well, I think from my perspective is that the challenges are common to wherever we are, and that we're all facing these you know, from different perspectives perhaps, but frankly, without working together, we're not going to be able to achieve the necessary outcomes, which are decarbonisation, and that is something that, you know, we have to keep always at the back of our minds, is that they, you know, whilst we are focusing on our own particular sector, there is a bigger issue, and I think that bigger issue is energy and how we're going to transition to that zero carbon globe. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Charles, if I come to you next.
I think the main thing from this call, my takeaway is Brazil has a huge opportunity as an e-fuel supplier with an abundance of wind and solar. So therefore, as a fuel producer, as an e-fuel producer, it can be an early adopter. And it's also got the shipping routes which support those early adopters as well. So it's in a very good position to be an early mover with the ambition. And that's where I'm of interest in sort of forming coalitions and collaborations and moving forward.
Brilliant, thank you. And then from the Brazilian point of view, Lavinia, if you don't mind.
Well, I'll build on previous presenters, and I say that collaboration for me is opportunities for collaboration would be key here. I think the task ahead is huge, it's giant and it's urgent. So I do think that we need to not only bring more stakeholders in Brazil to discuss the matter, but also build collaboration with other countries and with the UK. So for me, it's quite clear for me that we need to do that, and there's opportunities to do that.
Brilliant, thank you. And then Vice Admiral, do you have any final comments from your side?
Well, my speakers and for audience, thank you very much for the opportunity. I believe, we hope that we can, other than just GHG subject, but aspects as oil spills, we can have a UK partnership to discuss with other countries in scenarios as we have in IMO. And congratulations for the coordination and the organization of this meeting. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So we have run out of time now. So I'd just like to say thank you very much again to all of our speakers for your fantastic insights today. And thank you to the DIT team in Brazil for inviting me to moderate this session. I've really enjoyed it, and I think it's been really insightful, and I hope all the audience have enjoyed it too. So now I would just like to hand back to Laura for her closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you very much, everyone that attended to our conference. Thank you so much for all the speakers again. It was a pleasure to have that panel, and it's a pleasure to have you all here. So I just would like to remind you, you all, that tomorrow we will have the last session of our week of event. And the event will be about enabling an economic sustainable cycle for biofuels, the chain of custody of grains. It will be at 10 a.m. Brazil time, 1 p.m. UK time. And now I will do in Portuguese as well. Muito obrigada a todos pela presença. Lembrando que amanhã temos a última sessão da nossa conferência. Contamos com a presença de todos. E o tema da sessão de amanhã será viabilizando um ciclo econômico sustentável para os biocombustíveis, a cadeia de custódia dos grãos. Será às 10 horas da manhã, do horário de Brasília, ou 1 da tarde, no horário do UK. Muito obrigada mais uma vez pela presença de todos, foi um prazer.